Great. Thanks, Kath, for your, as usual, warm and lovely introduction to everybody as they're walking in. It's kind of an awkward moment for people when they're arriving, and you do it with such aplomb. Thank you so much. Welcome to this webinar, Memory Encroachments, Replotting the Past in Post-Atrocity Europe, Argentina, and the United States, presented by Dr. Kerry Wigham. As Kath said, she's excited about this webinar. I am also particularly excited about the topic, but more importantly, about the opportunity to hear from Dr. Wigham. This evening webinar, as already has been explained, is in partnership, a partnership between the Durban and Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Centers, but also supported by the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, the Auschwitz Institute, and the Institute of Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention. And we thank all of them for their amazing support. Welcome again to this incredible global audience. Particularly want to welcome Holocaust survivors who have joined us this evening, also teachers, academics, members of the diplomatic corps. In South Africa, we have obviously volunteers and supporters and our professional teams from the Durban and Johannesburg centers, but also from our sister center in Cape Town, the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Center. In addition to the South African audience, I counted on the registration sheet, there are members of the audience from 14 different countries, including Mauritius, Brazil and Argentina, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, New Caledonia, many countries in Europe, and of course the United Kingdom and the United States. So it's really, really wonderful to welcome all of you. And I would like to now formally introduce Kerry Wigham, and take up as little time as possible because I know you're in for a treat and we want to give Kerry as much time as possible. Kerry Wigham is the Assistant Professor of Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention at Binghamton University's Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention. He received a PhD in Performance Studies from New York University, where his dissertation was passed with distinction. He's published many scholarly articles, and he is the Communications Officer and a member of the Executive Board for the International Association of Genocide Scholars. He's also the curator of Artivism, an art exhibition on the connection between art, activism, and atrocity prevention that began in Venice during the 2019 Art Biennale and is now traveling to museums around the world. Tali and I heard Kerry present on Artivism at a webinar hosted by the Defined Requiem Foundation, and I was so taken and impressed with Kerry's presentation. I was raving about him to Tali, who knew him, and said, all right, I'll reach out to him and ask if he would present a webinar for our centers. So thank you, Tali, for that, and I'm so thrilled that you agreed, Kerry. Thank you so much. I'm also thrilled to hear that Artivism is traveling, the exhibition is traveling to South Africa soon, as well as Kerry. So both Kerry and the exhibition will be in South Africa, which is something we should all look forward to. In addition to his academic work, Kerry is the Director of Research and Online Education at the Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocities, an international non-governmental organization that works with over 80 countries around the world on creating public policy for the prevention of vulnerable groups, protection, I beg your pardon, of vulnerable groups, and the prevention of mass atrocities. Kerry's CV is exceptionally impressive in both postdoctoral research and teaching. His work has been presented at academic conferences and universities in 5 continents, and he's taught courses at New York University, Keene University, and Stockton University. Kerry's research focuses on the way that post-atrocity societies remember and engage with the past, along with how that violent past impacts the present and future. And in particular, his research engages the creation and curation of public memory sites, as well as grassroots civil society activism, both as a means for shaping public memory and transforming post-conflict societies. As part of this work, Kerry has conducted field research across Latin America, Europe, and the United States. I'm sure as South Africans, we are all particularly interested in the research and the doctoral studies that Kerry has engaged in, and I really look forward to the presentation. Thank you for joining us, and thank you so much, Kerry. If you wouldn't mind, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm very happy to be here today with all of you, I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today from New York City, which is the ancestral land of the Lenape. The Lenape have been and continue to be victims of settler colonial genocide. I want to extend a special thanks to Tally Nates of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center and Mary Klook of the Durban Holocaust and Genocide Center for the invitation to speak today. Thank you also for giving that little plug about artivism. I have to tell you that the exhibition, we really wanted to come to South Africa, but there are no solid plans yet. So we need to speak about that because one of your centers might be a great place for it to come. And I should also acknowledge that I saw one of the people who's joining us today, Linda Young. Her is one of the incredible artists whose work is featured in that exhibition. So if you are able to see it, it's starting in February in Winnipeg, Canada, and then hopefully it will be coming to South Africa and you can see her work and the work of many other people. But let me turn to the presentation today, and I'm going to share my screen. Everyone should be able to see this presentation now. So it's called Memory Encroachments, Replotting the Past in Post-Atrocity Europe, Argentina, and the United States. Now, over the past decades, the world has really witnessed the emergence of an array of diverse and innovative forms for memorializing the past, forms that give the past physical presence in the public sphere. And here I'm talking specifically around the evolution of memorialization practices in response to genocide and other mass atrocities. The architectural form of the monument or memorial has evolved as architects and artists have explored new formal languages for representing the seemingly unrepresentable horrors of genocide and mass atrocities. In recent years, however, yet another form of memorial practice has arisen. And this is a form that borrows from traditional memorial language, but also some newer memorial forms, for instance, what James Young refers to as counter monuments. These novel memorial objects that are really scattered throughout public space in specific cities or landscapes, take the form of sidewalk tiles with the names of victims or street signs marking the paths those victims traversed. They're seeking to spark historical dialogue by pervading the public sphere and infusing it with the past in order to transform the way that ordinary people engage with that past and the space around them. I call these objects memory encroachments. So this presentation is going to give you 3 different examples of memory encroachments and then talk a bit about what these encroachments do, what makes them a little different from other memorial forms potentially. But first, let me tell you what exactly I mean by a memory encroachment. So the central goal of memory encroachments is to intrude or intervene upon the daily life of passersby. They encroach upon our lives and the way that we encounter the world around us. Unlike traditional forms of memorialization, which typically utilize scale or these recognizable architectural forms to declare themselves very visibly, memory encroachments do not call attention to themselves quite so obviously. And usually they don't serve as sites of destination. For instance, they're not necessarily listed in tour guide books for tourists who are visiting places. Instead, most people don't make plans to visit these spaces. They happen upon them on the way to other things. These memory encroachments then really serve to create alternative cartographies or maps of the spaces inhabited by citizens of post-atrocity societies. At once, they make visible a cartography of violence that underlies our daily existence when we're living in a post-atrocity context, while at the same time mapping a new cartography of memory so that the past can shape the present and the future in new ways that potentially hopefully prevent the reemergence of violence, or at least contribute to prevention in some form. As I mentioned in this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on 3 examples of memory encroachments, though there are many more that we could talk about. The first you can see on the bottom right of your screen is a project known as the Stolpersteine project or Stumbling Stone project, which these exist in 24 countries across Europe today. In the top right, you'll see the baldosas por la memoria, the memory street tiles in Argentina and Buenos Aires. And on the left, you'll see a sign from the Trail of Tears National Historic Trail in my home country, the United States. So let me first explain to you a little bit more about these three memory encroachments, and then we'll talk a little bit more about what they do. So we'll start with what is surely the most well-known, typically, of these encroachments, the Stolpersteine. Stolpersteine typically is translated as stumbling stones. And this was a project that was developed and continues to be carried out by a German artist named Günter Demnig. He started it in 1992 and is still working on this project today. He called them stumbling stones. He says, when I've talked to him, his favorite explanation of the definition actually came after he came up with the name. When a small boy, about 8 years old, said, in trying to explain the name to himself, said they're called that because you don't stumble over them with your feet, but you stumble over them with your heart. So when you encounter these stones in the street, your heart stops on them and you see that place in a new way. So what they actually are, each Stolperstein is a brass plaque embedded in the sidewalk in front of the house, the former residence of a victim of National Socialism. Each stone says, here lived, and then the name of the person, their date and place of birth, their date and place of deportation, if it's known, and the date of their death, if that information is known. The Stolpersteine project memorializes all victims of Nazi crimes, so predominantly Jewish victims, but also Roma Sinti people, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, victims of the T4 program, etc. Each stone very purposefully only has one victim. So Demnig says it's one victim for one stone. And they're placed in front of the last residence of choice for the victim. So sometimes people would be forced to leave and go to other homes before being deported to a camp, for instance. The Stolperstein is put in front of the last residence that the person chose to live in. After the project got going, Demnig also started opening it up and commemorating survivors of the Holocaust as well, alongside people who did not survive, who were victims. And he sees this as a way of reuniting family members through the memory practice by having their stones next to each other. And as I said, this project began in Germany, but now there are over 70,000 of these Stolpersteine in 24 countries across Europe. The next memory encroachment are called the baldosas por la memoria. Baldosa is like a sidewalk tile, por la memoria, for memory. This is a project that began in the city of Buenos Aires, Argentina, by a group called Vecinos de Almagro, or the neighbors of Almagro. Almagro is a neighborhood in the city of Buenos Aires, to respond to the victims of the dictatorship, military dictatorship in Argentina, which lasted from 1976 to 1983. And during that 7.5-year period, as many as 30,000 Argentinians were disappeared, that is, kidnapped by the state, put into torture centers and detention centers where they were tortured. When enough information was extracted from them, they would be killed and their remains disposed of. So for many of the families of these victims, they still don't have their remains or know where they are. This project began in 2006 by this neighborhood group as a way of, in this pivotal moment of a resurgence of memory in Argentina, because in the mid-1980s through the 1990s, Argentina went through what's usually referred to as an era of impunity, where the president in the 90s, Carlos Menem, was really advocating an idea of forget and move forward. Let's not dwell on the past. But then after an economic crisis and a new president came to power in 2003, things started to shift and memory of the dictatorship started to resurge once again. While this project was started by this one neighborhood group, it ultimately grew, and now it's being conducted by neighborhood groups all over the city of Buenos Aires. And the idea is that these groups create these very colorful sidewalk tiles and place them in the sidewalks of Buenos Aires where disappeared persons lived, but also where they worked or where they studied. Sometimes many people are listed on the same baldosa. Contrary to the Stolpersteine, these are colorful memorials. They're meant, the colors of the memorials are meant to mark the personality of the person or people that are commemorated there and to communicate the vibrancy of the lives that they lived. Unlike the Stolpersteine, which Demnig does all of those on his own, these baldosas are created as a community project. So local school children become involved. Family members of the disappeared are also involved in their creation. There's a very public placement ceremony called a colocación that happens. And I'm going to talk more about that later. And also the group not only creates these tiles, but when they create the tiles for a person, they also do a lot of research into that person's life to document their story, their history, and they publish it in books like this one, which is just full of information about each of the people commemorated in the baldosas, and then tells you where you can go. There are maps to tell you where you can go and see that person's baldosa. The third memory encroachment are these markers along the Trail of Tears National Historic Trail. This is a network of sites that's administered by the US National Park Service. This began in 1987 as a way to commemorate the Trail of Tears, which was the largest act of ethnic cleansing in United States history. In the 1830s, 5 tribes in the southeastern United States, the Seminole, Chickasaw, Creek, Muskogee, Choctaw, and Cherokee were all forced to leave their homes and walk as long as 1,200 miles. Sorry, I should have converted that into kilometers, but maybe around 2,000 kilometers outside of what was then the United States. And most of them ended up in what is today Oklahoma. Along this National Historic Trail, it's a network of over 85 sites that cross 9 different US states. These sites range from memorials to museums to graveyards to sections of the trail that have been identified and marked. The most visited site on this trail is most definitely the Hermitage, which is actually the former plantation of Andrew Jackson, the president who orchestrated the expulsion of the Cherokee from their native land. The things that I really focus on are there are these street signs all along the trail, both on roads and on pathways off of the roads, that mark that this was part of the trail that the indigenous people walked along this journey. They also have a passport program with about 25 sites where people can get stamped that they visited sites along the way. And when I refer to memory encroachments, I'm really focusing less on the big tourist attractions like the Hermitage or the Cherokee Heritage Center, which is a museum, a really impressive museum managed by the Cherokee Nation in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, at the end of the Trail of Tears. I'm focusing more on the majority of the sites, which are just markers where the trail passed, where people died or were buried, river crossings, and small out-of-the-way memorials that have been created by individuals. So how do these memorials encroach? As I said, these memorial encroachments are not meant to be destinations, they're intrusions. People happen on them on the way to other things. So for instance, you could be going to the grocery store or walking to the bus stop, and all of a sudden you look down and see this glint from the brass plaque below your feet, and you read it and you understand very suddenly that this building that you've walked by many times perhaps you look at it in a different way and see that it actually was the former home of someone who died because of National Socialism in Germany or in another country. Or the same goes for the other memory encroachments. It changes the way that you see your environment. It resituates the site where you're standing when you come upon that memorial and reframes it as a site of violence. So through this metaphorical stumbling, memory encroachments reorient the viewer and her understanding of the landscape or the cityscape. It places her instead within a new geography, a memoryscape. Memory encroachments then are an example of what memory scholar Caitlin Murphy calls memory mapping. So according to Murphy, memory mapping is the aesthetic process of representing the affective, polyvocal, and temporally layered relationship between past, present, and place. And although this work performed through memory mapping is not cartography in the literal sense, Murphy writes that, and this is a quote too, the concept of mapping is useful because cartography is the attempt to define, mediate, and understand the historical and contemporary world by exploring how the spaces that constitute it are mapped. Memory encroachments like the stumbling stones and the others serve to remap the cities in which they're placed, illuminating these new cartographies that in fact already exist, but that lie beneath the surface of what is traditionally recognized on a daily basis. When a viewer stumbles upon a stumbling stone, the act of recognition that occurs is one in which the past is momentarily foregrounded. For an instant, at least, the house in front of which the stone is laid is not recognized for what it is in the present moment, but for what it was in the past. In that way, these memory encroachments are really rewriting public space and cityscapes in particular. So Michel de Certeau talks a lot about how the cityscape and the way a city is laid out is already a way of regulating the bodies of the inhabitants living within it. There are some ways that you can move through the space and other ways that you cannot or are not supposed to. But as we know very well, during periods of authoritarian rule and genocide, that public space becomes even more strictly regulated so that people must engage with it only in very specific ways or risk grave danger, even their lives. So you're wondering what this beautiful picture is, I'm sure. So this is a photo of a park or a plaza in Buenos Aires called Plaza UC. It's a beautiful park, it would be very generous to refer to this as a green space, as you can see. And this is actually when it's being improved because this square during the dictatorship, most of the greenery was totally removed and it became just this concrete block in the middle of this space. And the reason why is because during the dictatorship, the military junta saw any forms of public congregation as a threat, as a potential organization against the junta, a form of resistance, right? So they made it illegal to do anything but pass through public space. You couldn't stop and have conversations with groups of people, for instance. And the landscape and the cityscape were literally transformed to facilitate that level of restriction. Now this plaza is finally being redone and the plans for it look quite beautiful. I'm excited to visit it again. But anyway, memory encroachments also rewrite public space in a way that tries to undo the way that the space was rewritten during the periods of violence. They make the city or the landscape readable in different ways through that practice of walking. So here you can see 3 maps that sort of show on the left, these are some, all of the red marks are where baldosas are in one neighborhood in Buenos Aires. On the top left is, or top right, sorry, is a map of Stolpersteine in Berlin, quite an outdated one. There are many more right now. And on the bottom right are sites along the Trail of Tears National Historic Trail. Interestingly, the groups that do the baldosas in Argentina, they call what they are doing in Spanish, DESANDANDO CAMINOS. And this is a really provocative and interesting phrase that takes on multiple meanings in this context. So we could translate it literally, and what it would mean literally is something like retracing roads or retracing pathways. And this phrase echoes that notion of memory mapping that I've already talked about. the baldosas that are sprinkled throughout the city create these alternative pathways through the grid work of Buenos Aires. And when viewers find one baldosa, they may then be encouraged to look for more. So this encounter with the baldosas of the city traces new trails through the cityscape. That's reflected in that map. But caminos also has a more figurative meaning that can be translated as journeys. So, and really the members of the groups that are making these baldosas por la memoria are not only tracing new pathways in the sidewalks of the city, their work is also about retracing the journeys of the desaparecidos, the disappeared persons that they're commemorating. So as I mentioned, in addition to creating the baldosas, they're also doing this extensive research into their lives and publishing those stories in books so that they can tell the stories of those journeys, retrace those journeys for the public. All this work is really ensuring that the memorialized people are remembered not only as names in the sidewalk, but as individuals who lived, who in many cases fought for their beliefs, and who were murdered by the state because of it. But this expression takes on one final meaning, and it's really the hardest one to translate, because although desandando is usually translated as retracing or going back along something, the verb desandar literally means something like to unwalk or to ungo, because the prefix des has the sense of undoing something. And in the first book that they published, this book here, they explained the use of this term. They said, this is a quote, "For the sake of the," this is my translation, "for the sake of the truth, we cut through the systematic lies that the people have interiorized," end of quote. So in other words, in their view, the creation and placement of the baldosas across the city is also a means of unwalking the paths of oblivion and impunity that the country of Argentina experienced officially from the mid-1980s to the early 2000s. And importantly, the paths of denial that some segments of the population still uphold, though less and less. The baldosas use the truth of the desaparecidos' existence and the stories of their lives to create new paths forward, paths that intersect the systematic lies that the people have interiorized, paths that make the past plain by mapping it onto the sidewalks. Aside from affecting individuals one by one, memory encroachments also open spaces for historical dialogue among the creators of the encroachments, state actors, and the society at large, through which these actors negotiate how they understand and relate to the past. Historical dialogue is a term that's used to illustrate or define the conversations and practices through which those various actors, social actors, the state, civil society, negotiate how the past should be interpreted and engaged with in the present. And memory encroachments can serve as an innovative and a potentially productive voice in those processes of negotiating the past, of historical dialogue. And they do this in two ways I want to show you. First, memory encroachments can initiate new levels of dialogue among their creators, state actors, civil society. But second, they can serve as sites for new public practices and memory rituals that reinvigorate relationships and dialogues with the past. And I'm going to take these 2 points in turn. So here you see a picture of Demnig installing one of the Stolpersteine. This project actually began as a vigilante memory project. It was not official in any way. So it started because Demnig created a plaque in the sidewalk in Cologne to memorialize the Roma victims of Nazi crimes in Cologne. And an older woman came up to him when he had installed it and told him that she really appreciated the project. He thought it was beautiful, but she wanted him to know that in fact, there were no Roma victims of the Nazi atrocities in Cologne, which was obviously not true. But this gave Demnig an idea that he needed to do more to visibilize how these atrocities took place and the groups that were victim to them. So he started in Berlin by creating 50 of these Stolpersteine, and he placed them in the neighborhood of Kreuzberg, totally illegally with no permits. The city government of Berlin, which loves their permits and bureaucracy, were quite upset. But also no one wanted to be seen as the one that ordered these plaques memorializing victims of the Holocaust to be taken out of the sidewalk. And so they left them there. And they thought the best way that they could deal with this was to actually coordinate with Demnig, allow him to get official permits to install the Stolpersteine, and now it's become an officially sanctioned project in Berlin and many other cities, but not in all cities in Germany. So one of the most famous opposing viewpoints comes from Munich. Munich, a city that was very much in the heart of the birthplace of Nazism. But when Demnig installed two of the stones at the request of the family members of the victims in Munich, the two groups in Munich were outraged. One were, there was of course some anti-Semitic sentiment and anti-Semitic groups who wanted them out because it was giving us public space to the victims of the Holocaust. But the other group, the unexpected ally, were the Jewish community of Munich, because they saw the Stolpersteine as disrespectful, because it meant that people were walking over the names of the victims. So there were a lot of debates, very public debates, conversations about what to do. The result ultimately was that the Stolpersteines were outlawed, but a new project was created with plaques on the walls of the buildings, arguably more visible even than the Stolpersteine. What's interesting to me about this is less where one falls on that debate, but more that what the Stolpersteine did in that case was create this public debate where everyone had to actively engage with how they felt about the past, how they were going to relate with it. And in many ways, that conversation, that debate, secured a space for a Holocaust memory in a way that having a stone in the ground might not have done as much. So there are really these unexpected outcomes that can come from the creation of the memory encroachments. I'll give you another example of historical dialogue from the Trail of Tears. So many of the certified sites along the National Historic Trail are not constructed landmarks, as I mentioned, but they're actual segments of land known to have been a part of the original Trail of Tears. And these trail segments are marked by signage like this all along the trail when they're on public property. But much of the property that the Cherokee passed through on their forced removal in the 1830s is now private property. Of course, another illustration of the way that settler colonialism works. And so in constructing or building this network that is the National Historic Trail, the National Park Service offers an interesting opportunity to current owners of that land that was part of the Trail of Tears. If it can be certified that the Trail of Tears indeed passed through the property, then the National Park Service declares their property a certified site on the National Historic Trail and transforms these landowners, I'm making like there's like an annotation there, these landowners into what Jennifer Jordan calls memory entrepreneurs. But of course, in this case, they're not generating money from the historical legacy of their property. They are generating memory. One example of such a site is the Crab Abbott Farm, which is a very rural piece of farmland in southern Illinois through which the Trail of Tears passed. And the National Park Service website lists this farm as a certified site. It gives the location and a phone number if you go on the website. And under hours, it just states private property, visit arranged in advance by contacting the owner. So I traveled along the Trail of Tears with a few traveling companions visiting all of these sites. So when we got to this site, I called the number on the website, and a man named Joe Crabb picked up the phone, and he immediately invited me and my traveling companions to stop by. A few minutes later, we pulled off of rural Route 1 into the driveway of a very humble single-story home with this official sign. Two friendly Labradors greeted us, and those were followed shortly by Mr. Crabb, who was a sprightly senior citizen in blue jean overalls, a flannel shirt, and a baseball cap. He invited us into his home. We sat at his kitchen table. His wife remained in the living room watching television. She seemed to be playing the role of the patient wife suffering her husband's quirky obsession. But before we knew it, Crabbe was really handing us all of these informational pamphlets and maps and newspaper articles from local papers. He explained that really for most of his life, he had no idea that his farm had any connection to the Trail of Tears until he read a newspaper article in 2006 or 7. And that article talked about a university researcher doing research on the trail in Southern Illinois. He saw in the article, he read something that made it seem like he was talking about something that was part of his property. So he called up the researcher. The researcher came by and said, yes, indeed, the trail passed through here. The National Park Service came, certified that that was indeed the case. And they gave him a certificate, which now Crabbe proudly displays over his kitchen table. So once his farm became a part of the trail, it's safe to say that he became absolutely consumed with discovering more about the history of his farm and the Trail of Tears. He showed us pages of research that he had done, along with native artifacts or arrowheads that he had uncovered on his property or on neighboring properties. He passed us a glossy pamphlet entitled The Trail of Tears Across Pope County, Illinois, that he had written and published with his daughter. So Crabbe's evolving interest in Native American history, which he developed through engaging with the history of his own property, demonstrates how that what begins as amateur archaeology can become a meaningful social practice that contributes to the production of heritage and memory. And by inviting travelers onto his property and into his home to share what he has found, this initiative is also creating communities of other memory keepers. But aside from being these sites of historical dialogue and conversation, the memory encroachments are also sites that provide spaces for other ritual memory practices. And I want to give you a few examples. Back to the Stolpersteine. I don't know how I can get this. Oh, see, I went too far now. This annotation off. Let's see. Okay. So it's very typical on the anniversary, for instance, of Kristallnacht in November, that people will come and lay roses and put candles next to the Stolpersteine in cities across Germany. So when you're walking through the city on those anniversaries, you'll see entire sidewalks covered in like candlelight. It's quite impressive to watch and just shows you the scale of this project and of course, the violence that it represents. When I was doing fieldwork in Berlin in 2013, which is the 55th anniversary of Kristallnacht, there were even groups who created these little packets that they were handing out with polishing cloths. This isn't actually one of the polishing cloths, but that I'm showing you in this next picture. This is a tissue, but it gives you an idea. There were these polishing cloths that they handed to people and asked them to go out and polish at least one of the Stolpersteine to commemorate Kristallnacht that year. So you can see how these have become a space for other people to assert their own agency around memory in their own contexts. Relating to the baldosas, as I mentioned, the creation of the baldosas is already a memory ritual because school children are involved in making these baldosas and choosing which colorful mosaics they're going to put around. And it's used by the organizations that make them as an opportunity to teach the kids about human rights and promote those sorts of values moving forward. Whenever the baldosas are placed, they have a very public ceremony called a colocación, where they'll set up a microphone and an amplifier on the sidewalk where the baldosa is going to be laid. And people come gather around, the friends and family who know about it. But inevitably, those groups block the sidewalk. So people who pass by have to either go around on the street, or more often, they stop and watch the ceremony and become a part of these placement ceremonies as well. People speak and tell the stories of the family members or friends, tell the stories of the people that are being commemorated by that baldosa, and then the baldosa is put into the ground, as you can see here. But one other interesting thing I wanted to show you is a theater company that engaged with the baldosas in a really compelling way. So this is a group called Funciones Patrióticas, or patriotic functions. They developed a performance that would be translated as a situated tale, a topography of memory, that happen every Sunday evening in the neighborhood of Almagro. The founders of the group appreciated the baldosas that were placed in their neighborhood, but they worried that they were getting lost in the hustle and bustle of the city. So in response, they created a performance that centers around the baldosas and creates a more intimate connection between audience members and those commemorated through the memory encroachment. So audience members meet at a central location, and then they receive maps like this that tell them different places that they're supposed to go to different baldosas in the immediate walking vicinity. And at each baldosa, they see a different performance that takes place that is connected in some way with the person memorialized at that baldosa. So at one, for instance, audience members hear two men singing a song while playing a guitar. At another, a woman sits and draws pictures of a house that resembles the house that the disappeared son promised to one day buy for his mother. This engagement with the baldosas demonstrates that memory of the past is a continual project. It doesn't come to an end when the last baldosa is laid. Rather, the laying of the baldosas and other memory encroachments is only one step in a much larger and longer public discourse over the past and how society relates to it. Funciones Patrióticas then sees itself as advancing the work that is started by the placement of the baldosas. Just as these baldosas encroach upon the public sphere when they're first laid, the performances of Funciones Patrióticas also intervene in this space to increase their visibility, as well as to create more direct connections between the baldosas and the audience members. And when they're successful, the audience members then feel charged to carry that memory forward and to spread it to others, thus increasing the visibility of the memory project and consequently of the past. And finally, back to the Trail of Tears National Historic Trail. Each year, the Cherokee Nation organizes what it calls the Remember the Removal bike ride, where a group of Cherokee teenagers gather and ride their bikes from New Echota, Georgia, which was the pre-removal capital of the Cherokee Nation, to Tahlequah, Oklahoma, the current capital of Cherokee Nation. Along the way, they visit many of the sites included on the National Historic Trail. As I mentioned, this is a 2,000-kilometer journey that they bike. They're accompanied by tribal elders and at least one historian who passes along information to the participants. The Cherokee Nation Principal Chief, Bill John Baker, describes the event by saying, and this is a quote, "Each and every year, the Remember the Removal effort enables some of Cherokee Nation's strongest emerging leaders to participate in a unique event that is focused on individual growth, teamwork, development, and most importantly, sharing Cherokee heritage and history." Jack Baker, a tribal council member who's also accompanied the participants as a historian, echoes these sentiments when he states, "The important part is not only that we remember our ancestors and pay honor to them, but we also are made aware that they survived and built a new nation so that we are here today." Here, Baker illustrates a key aspect of the bike ride, but also of all memory practices. Although they're certainly most clearly oriented toward the past, they're also deeply related to the ways that we envision our present and future. Just as the Remember the Removal bike ride commemorates those who died along the trail, it also celebrates what Gerald Visner calls the survivance of Native peoples. All these ritualized memory practices represent a commitment to the future, that the past will not only be remembered, but that it will shape our decisions moving forward. They're the result both of a long social dialogue that led to their enactment, as well as the next intervention in a dialogue that will continue, through which societies will keep negotiating how the past will inform the present and the future. Now, ideally, all sites and practices of memory do the work of memory encroachments through intervening in the public sphere. I'll unshare now. They seek to reorient the thinking and attitudes of state and civil society actors in a way that considers and honors the past and the present. Most large memory initiatives, however, require some level of that commitment to be in place from the beginning. For a person to visit a former site of mass atrocity, to see a film or a piece of theater on genocide, or to participate in some structured education program on a period of past violence, the individual must already have some foreknowledge of that with which she will be engaging. The great potential of memory encroachments is that they have a potential to impact all, even those who are not making a deliberate effort to engage with the past. They're most powerful when they come out of nowhere, when they intervene on one's daily life in an unexpected way. This moment of encounter with the memory encroachment opens up new spaces of possibility. Of course, this encounter could lead to nothing. It could lead to the passerby just moving along without giving the encroachment any further thought. When they are noticed, however, when the memory encroachments succeed at intruding upon the banal space of the everyday, blurring the bounds of time and bleeding some of the past into the present, a new world emerges. The passerby suddenly becomes an agent in the ongoing dialogue regarding the past and the role it plays today. And the moments that follow could lead to the transformation of that individual's daily practices, such that the hope of ensuring that this violent past remains in the past, that the future will not see the recurrence of such violence, becomes bit by bit more thinkable. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carrie. Wow, what an amazing talk and very, very thought-provoking. And already people are starting to share some of their ideas. And perhaps I'll start with Anna Maria Ola Bukowska, that was born in the States, but teaching in Krakow at the Jagiellonian University. And she's saying, I did my MA at SIU Carbondale, hiked in the Shon Forest, visited a friend in Golonda, about 15 minutes away from the Crab Abbott farm. I've taught about the Trail of Tears and yet never knew that it passed through a territory I knew so well. And maybe if you can share with us, there was a question that I got privately, why some memorials succeed? In other words, the stumbling stones are so well known, people are actually looking for them now, while others don't, and people do not know about it. QR cards on buildings, for example, that I saw in Denmark, or even the Bavarian Quarter art installation that not everyone knows about and goes to see the signs. How do you explain that?
Well, the question of success when we're talking about memorials or sites of memory is a really complicated one, because we first have to decide what do we mean with the success? What do we want them to succeed at doing? One of the really unfortunate things that I think has emerged with this, and it comes from this commonly quoted phrase from George Santayana that was even in one of the polls before, the idea that he who does not remember the past is condemned to repeat it. There's somehow this idea that simply remembering is on its own going to be a preventive force, is going to make genocidal violence not happen. And I think that is entirely overly optimistic. Memory, of course, is a neutral concept. Memory on its own is not always good, right? There are plenty of instances that we can think of in any of the societies or cultural contexts from which we're coming, in which memory has been used to promote social division, to promote violations of human rights, etc. So memory on its own is not always good, nor is it always preventive. So what we want memory sites and memorials to do is to actually contribute to preventing, I think we have to think I won't say we don't need to think about what those sites look like, because in fact, I'm a deep believer in the idea that creative, innovative memorial sites and uses and memorial objects like this can have great power. But we need to be thinking just as much as how people engage with those spaces and how we how creators of that space open space for engagement. So you can have the most beautiful memorial in the world that was designed by a star architect, for instance, but if people go there and don't take away anything from that experience, don't feel like they actually are transformed in some way, then what's the point, right? So I feel like I'm probably getting away from the question itself, but this is like I feel like it's related in some way. Memory sites and memorials and memory encroachments don't always succeed. And this comment about passing by these places many times and never noticing them is an example of how they don't. What's particularly powerful to me, memory encroachments, is that they are spaces full of potential, because they're most powerful when the person who has passed by them day after day and never noticed them suddenly notices them, and if it actually makes them conceive of that space in a new way. So maybe now, even though you're not passing by it, you're thinking about those roads that you passed by in a different way, even though you're not physically encountering the memory encroachment. So there's some hope in that. Obviously, it's not the solution. It's not that that encounter is going to, on its own, solve and prevent all future violence or identity-based violence, but it's a starting point. There's a lot of potential there to do other things. And
maybe we continue with a comment from Maria Florencia Segura from the Embassy of Argentina in South Africa, that is thanking you very much about the very good explanation about baldosas por la memoria in Argentina. And she is reflecting a little bit about Argentina's policy of state since 2003, with the three branches involved: executive, legislative, and judiciary, and embracing a policy of memory, truth, and justice. And that includes, she's mentioning memorials and museums and so on. And I wonder if you can discuss a little bit further that role of state. You spoke a little bit about damning and the city wanting to take out the Stolpersteine, but where the state plays in your topic.
Yeah, that's great. First, I want to say muchas gracias por la pregunta y por venir. Yeah, Argentina is really a model for the world about dealing with the past, but also how the process of dealing with the past is not always unidirectional. It's not always moving forward. There are also steps backwards, but just because there are steps backwards doesn't mean things can't start moving forward again. And that's a particularly important message that I'm trying to tell myself now as a United States citizen after the last election. Argentina is an amazing case because after the dictatorship ended in 1983, Argentina invented these forms of what today we call transitional justice. At the time, they didn't have that name, but these just creative ways for dealing with the past in the immediate aftermath of the dictatorship, including one of the world's first real truth commission, I would say, the first time that a state has put its own leaders on trial in a domestic forum. That stopped because of a continued military threat and then some political moves to try and just move forward, rebuild the economy. But as I mentioned, in 2003, things really turned around, and that was largely because first, it was because a new president was elected who was willing to acknowledge that memory of the past and acknowledging the violence of the past is essential for building a society that protects human rights today. But that could only have happened because of the decades of work of civil society groups that pushed the government to reach that point. And Argentina is a society that for decades and still today has one of the most vibrant civil societies that you can see anywhere. The Baldosa project, in the beginning, that period of 2006 when it started, it wasn't all cheery. Not everyone was on board with the new state project of acknowledging the past and really confronting the crimes of the dictatorship. And when I talked with the members of Vecinos de Almagro who started making them, they would talk about how very often the baldosas and other memory sites around the city would be desecrated quite often by people who were denying the crimes of the dictatorship or wanted to erase them. And in the face of that, they just had to keep going out, repairing the baldosas, polishing them. And they saw that and continue to see that as their contribution to making sure that despite the efforts of those who don't want to remember this, they will make sure that this has a space in the public forum. And it's because of their work and the work of all of these other groups that now today in Argentina, you would be a pariah to defend the military dictatorship. It happens so very rarely nowadays. There is such great consensus now around this memory narrative, thanks to the work of these civil society groups and memory actors.
So Gladwin Lehman is asking maybe a follow-up question. Have there been any desecrations of stumbling stones, and how will they survive over time? I don't know, roadworks, changes in the city, and so on.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know specifically if there have been desecrations of stumbling stones, but I would not be surprised if there were. They are maybe a little harder to desecrate only because of the material is a bit sturdier. It's the brass plaque and the baldosas are made more of mosaics and concrete, so they're a little easier to desecrate. As far as road work and things, there are times when sidewalks need to be repaired in Berlin, for instance, and the stones will have to be taken up temporarily. But from what I know, they're always put back down. And because now it's a permitted and legal process, people really take great care. And this has become a part of the landscape of many of the cities of Berlin and other places across Europe that people really value and take care of, even if they have no direct connection to the people being memorialized on the specific stumbling stones.
Brilliant. David Estrin is asking, can you talk about counter efforts to invoke similar practices, but to erase, deny, or alter the truth? Is there a competition for memory space, cartography? How might we counter address this?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, David. Thanks for coming and for the question. This goes back to that point that memory is a neutral term. Sometimes it can be used for good things. Sometimes it can be used for bad things. In the United States right now, and I know that South Africa has gone through similar processes with the statues from both colonialism and the apartheid era. In the US, we're having a moment of trying to understand what to do with these statues to the Confederate period in the United States. And the ways that people are engaging with those spaces and the debates we're having around them are really compelling examples of the way that these sites of memory, both good or bad, can open up these conversations and lead to new avenues for social change. I'd love to hear if anyone knows, but I don't know of any sort of counter monument on the scale of the Stolpersteine, for instance, that is working towards a more negative form of memory. I suppose you could say every time we see a swastika graffiti somewhere is an example of this of that in some way, right? But there are absolutely memory practices that are being conducted by groups who are trying to use memory as a form of, as I said, increasing social division, for the rise of nationalism, white supremacy, etc. I'm co-editing a volume that's coming out next year called The Handbook of Memory Activism. And one chapter about that actually that I did not write is focusing on those practices, actors who are using the tools of memory activism and engaging with public space to promote a narrative that's quite nationalist and quite detrimental and damaging to the social fabric. But I'd love to hear if anyone has examples of memory encroachments in this sense that works like that.
So there are a few people that would love to engage with some open mic, if you don't mind, Carrie.
Please.
It's up to you.
I love it.
And wonderful. So maybe first of all, we have the Linda Young, the artist. I'm not sure if she wrote something down, but I'm not sure if she would like to speak a little bit. Linda, it's up to you. But if you are willing to share your thoughts as you shared on the chat, please unmute yourself and share.
Hi.
Hi, Linda.
Yeah. Hi, how are you?
Great.
Great to hear you and the presentation. It's Wonderful. So as you're familiar with Canada, the land that was purchased initially when Canada was settled also moved First Nations onto reserves. And I was thinking about your reference to the Trail of Tears and the markers along that that route. Now, if this was in Canada and we had markers like that, we would want to stop and make our offerings and our prayers to immediately recognize that this has taken place on this route. But the problem is we're trespassing now when we go on, like if this was a landowner's place, we would not be allowed to go on there. And so I was wondering if you came across any of that because there's a tension between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Canada. So I'm just wondering if that kind of tension also happened when you were doing your research and just going along that trail.
Yeah, thank you for that, Linda. And I just want to say that Linda is a person that I'm just so grateful that she's a part of my life. I have learned so much from her through her artwork, but also through her sharing of knowledge with me in the most generous way possible. And a lot of the ways that I think about these things has been impacted by her work. So thank you. So the official sites on the Trail of Tears, to achieve that official certification as a member of the site, they have to be open to people visiting them. And so many of the sites, especially sites that were burial grounds, those are open and created as memorial spaces. So you'll often, when you visit them, see people who are there who have left offerings behind in remembrance of the people who are remembered there. The interesting and tricky thing is, though, that also they have these trail markers basically every mile or so along the route from Georgia to Oklahoma, this 1,200 mile, 2,000 kilometer route. So there are these markers all along the way saying you are on the original route of the Trail of Tears. Now, what's also interesting is that because so many Indigenous people made this forced removal, they were really creating roadways, pathways that would be later used by traders and colonizers as they moved westward, because these pathways were pioneered by the Indigenous people through their forced removal. And then when roads started to be built, they were being built on top of those roadways that had already been traversed. So a lot of the Trail of Tears today are on interstate highways that have been built over them. So you can't actually stop at all because it's an interstate highway. So you're literally driving along this highway at 90 kilometers per hour and seeing the signs pass by saying, you're on the Trail of Tears, you're on the Trail of Tears. I feel like, as I talked about before, there are probably many people who don't even recognize the signs or take a moment to consider the impact of that. But that was something that really drove home to me, because I kept thinking, why were these highways built over the Trail of Tears? But then it was purely a logistical choice, because it was easier to construct these major roads over these pathways that had been built literally on the blood of Indigenous people who had crossed. So it's just another example of how past genocide in the past continues to have an impact on our present in the very landscape that we live in.
Yeah.
And I'm inviting Ashraf Marwan, please, to unmute yourself and pose your thoughts and question.
Hi, first I'd just like to say thank you so much for giving this talk. I found it very interesting. My question for you is, what parallels can we draw between memory encroachments and the efforts specifically in Germany to erase these memory encroachments or stop them from happening, especially the anti-Semitic ones, with the actual policies and atrocities committed by the Nazi regime during the Holocaust? Like, how can we see some of the themes and motivations of the Nazi regime alive today in relation to memory encroachments?
Yeah, thanks very much for that question. So as Mary mentioned in my introduction at the beginning, in addition to being a researcher and academic, I also work at an international NGO called the Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocities. And in that institute, we work with predominantly government actors all over the world to help train and assist in the development of public policies that will protect vulnerable populations in whatever context. And we work in countries in every global region and at every level from the global north, the global south, et cetera. One thing that I'm super convinced of because of that, again, this goes back to what I was saying at the beginning, memory is not enough, right? Building memorials is not enough to deal with the resounding legacies of genocidal violence and the ways that it continues to have impacts on the present. It is a component of confronting those legacies, but it is not on its own sufficient. For any society to really sufficiently respond to past violence and its resonating effects, that requires a holistic approach that involves every institution within a government, that involves all levels of society, not just governmental actors, but civil society actors, educators, business people, et cetera. It involves revolutionizing educational policy so that next generations are made aware, not just of what happened in the past, but its impacts on the present and what they can do to ensure that human rights and civil rights of their fellow citizens are protected, and their responsibility to ensure that as they grow older. So when you see the desecration of memory sites, to me, that is a symptom of a society that is not doing enough in those other areas as well to respond to in that it's giving space for that opinion, that viewpoint about the past to be permissible. What we want is a society not where we're just punishing people for having negative viewpoints. We want to build societies where it becomes impermissible for those any of those opinions to be expressed publicly and accepted as legitimate opinions to have. There are certain, I'm a very, there are lots of gray areas, but there should be some, this is my perspective, and here you see, I'm a very big champion of the international human rights regime, which many view as a colonizing force. But I simply cannot accept anything other than the starting point of any conversation has to be that every single one of us has equal dignity and equal rights. And if there's anyone that is starting from a different point than that, I'm almost not interested in the conversation, because that is a problem on their side. That's not a problem on my side. Do you know? Maybe that's being a little too stubborn, but
I absolutely agree with you. That the act of acknowledging and memory and remembering what happened isn't enough. It's simply just the first step. Mm-hmm. But more specifically, I really would like to know a little bit more. You did mention desecration. So how does the desecration of these sorts of memory encroachments kind of draw a parallel to perhaps efforts to erase these identities, or more of like a direct parallel to actual events we saw the Nazi regime undertake during the years of the Holocaust?
Well, I mean, I think that the desecration of memory sites is a visible symbol of the idea that sort of sentiment is still alive, right? So I think that it should be viewed, if we're looking from an atrocity prevention lens, then we would view that as a risk factor that exists in that society, a risk factor that needs to be responded to through other public policy initiatives, through civil society initiatives, et cetera. So I see that desecration as, rather than looking at it as the desecration itself, looking at that as evidence of something larger that's happening within a society that needs some wholesale response.
I see what you mean. It does kind of mean that if people can go out there and desecrate that, that means that the society has the potential to revert back to where they were.
Yes, exactly.
More and more these days. Thank you.
Thank you.
Carrie, there are a few people that are sharing nice resources, and you
Right.
asked for comments. So maybe just to draw your attention to Ruth Mandel. I'm not sure if Ruth wants to also unmute herself and just say something, but she is speaking about what is happening in Germany, about desecration of the stumbling stones in Germany, and also about some research papers. Ruth, I'm not sure if you want to just say a few words.
Sure. Thank you, Carrie, for very, very interesting. My colleague, Rachel Lehr, and I have been doing research on Stolpersteine for several years now. We're doing anthropological research, so we're doing ethnographic work, not only in Germany, but we've worked in about 7 different countries, and have just published an article in the Journal of Jewish Studies that just came out last month, that comes out of Oxford, and that's available. And I also posted an online, much shorter piece that's you can download, and I posted the link to that in the chat. It's called in something called Allegra Labs, and in about a week or so we're going to be presenting a recent paper about desecration, and different kinds of desecration, different kinds in it for a conference called the International Network of Hate Studies. And so we're in the final process of preparing that. And just to answer the question that you referred to a few minutes ago about desecration of Stolpersteine, there's been an enormous amount of vandalism. Rachel and I have been to many, many installations of Stolpersteine in many countries. In Berlin, not long ago, well, 2 years ago, I guess it was, we went to one where Günther was replacing a stone that had been vandalized by neo-Nazis. In one night, 20 stones in that neighborhood had been vandalized by neo-Nazis. That happens all the time. I mean, most stones do not get vandalized, but sometimes they're scratched. All kinds of things happen, and he's very determined to put in replacement stones whenever that happens. And I also mentioned in the chat that we've done a lot of research in Norway on Stolpersteine. They call them Snublestein there, and sometimes snow removal equipment can harm them, and so they're now experimenting with installing them just below the surface. So, you know, to protect them. And as you mentioned, there's many neighborhood groups in Germany in particular that monitor them regularly, and there is some places throughout Europe have online places where you can report any damage that you've seen. So there are lots of networks that do, you know, communities of care is what we call them, take care of them. So anyway, thank you
so
very
much for sharing that, Ruth. I really look forward to reading your work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Carrie, it's really interesting to read some of the comments, for example, Peter Houston and few other South Africans that are saying, thank you and brilliant talk and so on, but how it's really needed in South Africa. We need to engage with mapping a new cartography of memory, you know, and he asked if there is a link in the enduring success of memory encroachment project organizing from below, grassroots, versus the above, you know, the government or state, you know, in national projects that you can see.
Yeah, so that's a great question. Two of the Stolperstein and the Baldosas are both grassroots civil society-led projects. The Trail of Tears National Historic Trail is a government-led project in collaboration with predominantly the Cherokee Nation, which is also, of course, a government project. But I would say that typically these memory encroachments, though, have been a tactic of civil society versus a strategy of the state, as DeSartell would put it. Because they take up smaller areas of public space, they often start as more vigilante forms of memory activism. The baldosas started not as the tiles, they started as little stickers that they would put on the walls, but people would deface the stickers, so they knew they needed something more permanent. I think because the idea of a state memorial more typically aligns with traditional forms of monumentality, large scale design of large swaths of space that are dedicated towards memory, in particular, hiring a big time architect to design that space, et cetera. The memory encroachments have not typically been a tool of the state. They've been more a tool of civil society actors, which of course is not to say that that couldn't change in the future. I think it's just their small nature makes them seem more viable for civil society actors.
I would like to invite David Stream to unmute himself. He has some answers and some suggestions for your question, Kerry, about memorials and so on.
Hi, everyone. Tali, can you hear me all right? Great. Hi, everyone around the world. I just wanted to share a couple of resources, and especially for those folks looking at the U.S. landscape, there's a wonderful organization called Monument Lab led by Paul Farber, who's been doing work to conduct a national audit of U.S. memorial spaces and monuments, especially with respect to racial injustice, and they received a $4 million grant from the Mellon Foundation. And just speaking more broadly, the Mellon Foundation is investing, I believe, $250 million in this realm. So it's just a really important step from the philanthropic community to bring more light to this space. I know we're all resource constrained, but just wanted to shine a light on Monument Lab and their resources. I shared a link to what they call their field trip. And so you can work with students and educators to actually do like a local audit of your own community, and perhaps you would find the Stolpersteine among other resources and memory spaces in your community. So just something positive that is developing, at least in the US context.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Absolutely. And Kerry, finally, just many people thanking you. Brilliant talk. You can read the chat. We will save the chat, and hopefully we can share some of the resources shared by many of the people. So maybe just to let you maybe close for this evening before I do the official thank yous.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
just,
me?
The floor is yours for 1 minute, just to close our session tonight.
Oh, well, I'm very grateful I'm looking forward. It's hard to read the chat when I'm also talking, so I'm very much looking forward to reading all of this later. Thank you so much for coming here, for spending a little bit of time with me and with each other. I invite you to visit the websites for the two institutions of which I'm a part, the Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocities, which is at auschwitzinstitute.org. You can also find information there about Artivism, the exhibition, or go to artivismexhibition.com. And then also my institutional affiliation, the Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention, or IGMAP, because it's a handful, at Binghamton University. We have, through IGMAP, we have monthly webinars that people might also be interested in. So we'd invite you to attend those as well. Thanks so much. I'm so grateful for the invitation and for all of the comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Kerry. And I'm threatening to invite you again next year. So, so just be ready, because there are so many amazing topics that you can speak about. And we are looking forward very much to part 2. So
me too.
So thank you very much. Thank you to the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center team and the Durban Holocaust and Genocide Center team for your hard work and for bringing it all together. Thank you all for joining us tonight, this morning, and hope that you can join us again. Our next webinar will be actually on Sunday evening, that will be for members only, and it will be a virtual tour of Holocaust sites in Ukraine. So if you are interested to see the past, the present, the future in the Ukraine, please join us, and that will be on Sunday at 7 o'clock. Good night, and see you again soon. Thank you so much.
Bye.